Well, we thought we would drop in really quickly and record our spontaneous reaction, if you will, to the Supreme Court decision this week. If you hadn't heard, the Supreme Court released its 8-1 decision in favor of Kailey Chiles against Colorado's conversion therapy ban. We've been preparing for this moment for months, really since October when we heard the case. We were privileged enough to be in the Supreme Court to hear the oral arguments and have been tracking with the case. We've submitted 2 amicus briefs in favor of Childs and free speech. And so, when we were sitting in the case and we heard the arguments, it seemed absolutely clear what direction the Supreme Court would go. Like, um, among our friends on the LGBTQ side, the outcome was, oh, we are going to lose the case. I think everyone realized it was a First Amendment breach. And so, but we haven't known how large of a decision it would be. Like 8-1 is a massive statement from the Supreme Court. There's not really division on the court regarding the protection of free speech in a counseling space. So this is massive for every state that has a conversion therapy ban in place. But even beyond that, it's a declaration from the Supreme Court that in any arena, they're going to uphold free speech and freedom of religion. That
Mhm.
intersection is so key. The Supreme Court is going to protect that at all cost.
And for someone like you or me who has LGBT in their background, it's freedom of conscience. I mean, that's what one thing that's been so scary for you or me or all the people that we are trying to help with this experience in their lives is it's like, will the state be mandating what my conscience can be or what help I can find to align with my conscience and my religion?
Yeah.
So it's a big day for us when we consider those factors.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't remember how long ago this Supreme Court decision was or even what case it was attributed to. I just remember Clarence Thomas's response. And that was that professional, expert opinions, like from the medical world, so-called experts, are also subject to viewpoint discrimination. That in our culture, over reliance on medical expertise can also be a slippery slope. And what he points to is the acceptance of the lobotomy, for example. And so, even though all these professional guilds, like the APA's American Psychological Association, wants to say that conversion therapy, so-called conversion therapy, which maybe we should talk in a minute about even what that is harmful. Views on that position or on approaches to sexual orientation may change. And that was one of the discussion factors in the Supreme Court. They observed that there's a strong ideological element to LGBTQ and that popular opinion on that issue shouldn't really drive how we interpret the First Amendment.
Yeah, I mean, and things that probably the public don't know is in many cases, these professional guilds, we've heard those names or those acronyms dropped so many times in the news that we tend to think the AMA, American Medical Association, that's some official entity that presides over all medicine or something like that. And in fact, it's just a professional guild, which many doctors don't ascribe to, but seems to have this authority that in many cases isn't even based upon science trusted or rigorously tested scientific evidence. And that's absolutely true in the case of transgender procedures and things like that. So
Mhm.
super grateful to Justice Thomas for seeing through some of that and working to really protect freedoms at the deepest level.
Mhm. And, I think that we're at an important moment that you and I have been discussing for years in the US, which is this reevaluation of LGBTQ, understanding the worldview around it. It's not simply a biological experience. It has a whole ideological array around
Mhm.
it. And so it's such a complex issue. And so the civil rights discourse around LGBTQ, I think, is going to change dramatically over the next few years. It already is, but I think it's going to change dramatically. There's a lot I could say about that, just even observations. Just this month, Relevant magazine published some studies, an analysis of the CDC's study on behaviors by Jean Twenge. And she observed that women in particular have changed their identity status from bisexual to heterosexual in large numbers, peaking
Hmm.
in 20 or 22 among women who were 18 to 24, you know, decreasing their allegiance to or their acceptance of that identity by over 20% in the last 3 years. And
Yeah.
and
Wow.
so there's just so much confusion around LGBTQ. There's a lot I could say about that that's not relevant to this conversation, but I want to start talking about. So maybe for everybody who's listening, let's talk about what conversion therapy is
Hmm.
and what some of the claims are around it.
Hmm. What's tragic about it is the way that that term has been weaponized and used against all kinds of groups, and the profound impact it's had on law and culture, because it's oftentimes that term is defined based upon what the objectives are that they're trying to use that term for, as opposed to being a clear defined thing. Like when I say chair, everybody pictures a chair, but conversion therapy includes harmful tactics, torturous tactics sometimes. In other cases, it's talking about talk therapy. And so that's the first thing I think needs to say about it is nobody knows exactly what that term means because it changes based upon the intent.
Yeah, that's right. It's really nowhere legally defined in a way that can be objectively measured.
Hmm.
So people are going to be hearing today and throughout the next weeks about the torture of conversion therapy. And if we look at LGBTQ history and we look at approaches, say, with 60s and 70s, they definitely used aversive techniques in order to try to sway psychological effects and ideas. But those practices are never heard of one of those practices being used today, like shock. And, never ECT, for example, electroconvulsive therapy. I have friends who have undergone those therapies for bipolar disorder type 1 who have benefited greatly from that. But that is
Hmm.
not an aversive approach. That is not an approach that's ever been taken for same sex sexuality. So, really, when we're talking about the harms that could take place in a private setting, we're talking about ethical issues that are already illegal in the United States, like touching between the counselor and the client or viewing pornography or other things. Those are already illegal. They have nothing to do with conversion therapy, really. So, then what is conversion therapy? Well, it really comes down to viewpoint discrimination. It's bias against any counseling approach that protects a biblical sexual ethic, an orthodox historic biblical sexual ethic, and prioritizes that in the counseling setting, irregardless. Like licensed therapists today, always the priority is
Hmm.
the client's goals, and then the client's own values. And if you can't protect the client's religious values, then that's very challenging. And every conversion therapy band says you can do anything, but you can't protect a religious value that does not affirm LGBT. And so it's really not a therapeutic approach at all. It's an effort by the state to suppress Christian values in a counseling space.
It's also highly reductionist. So it's lumping every potential situation that someone could find themselves with as far as sexual feelings into one bucket and saying all of this should be, handled this one way. When, I mean, there are people who report to having had same-sex attraction feelings from early on in life. But then there are others that you and I have met with in recent years who they're 40 years old or older, and they experience some kind of a trauma, whether it's sexual violation or something like that. And the woman does, for example, and then starts to have same sex attraction feelings. But she's been married to her husband for 20 years. She has 3 kids, and she would like to have counseling to help her deal with that trauma and move back into attraction for her husband. I
Mhm.
know a man who came to me when he was older than 50 who had never had any same sex attraction in his life until having viewed porn during a season of having been divorced and the pain of that. And now he's trying to stay in his new marriage, but has these things to deal with. So, when you just call something, conversion therapy or whatever, and suggest that the whole thing is bad, you're not considering a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the conclusions that I draw as a result of the research for my doctoral dissertation is that it's easy actually to define the LGBTQ worldview and the ideology around it. And when you do that, then you can start to see that not every sexual minority wants to adopt that ideology.
Hmm.
And so, in the categories of public conversation so far, it's always been the presumption that if you experience same sex attraction, the best thing for you is to embrace that and then adopt this ideology, forcing you into this new
Hmm.
worldview away from a biblical worldview. And once you start to see that, then you recognize there really must be options for every person. This
Hmm.
isn't about whether or not you can change. It's about personal agency and
Right.
making choices about how you want to live
Hmm.
and what you want to believe.
Yeah.
And that's so vital in this conversation.
Absolutely. And I'll just point out that change movement, I'll speak on behalf of us, but also all those that we work with on Capitol Hill, Christian and conservative activists, I don't know of a single one of them that's trying to take away freedoms or options from people that have LGBTQ in their lives and are wanting to head down that pathway or even find counseling in alignment with their goals to live out a gay life, for example. I don't know anybody who is trying to shut down those freedoms or those options. And so
Yeah.
we're advocating for freedom for everyone to choose to be able to follow their faith and align with it, their conscience and align with it. There should be an awareness here that tolerance is actually what we're offering
Yeah.
as
I mean,
opposed to something else.
that's right. That's really good. We're not, I think some from the progressive left might frame this as now it's going to be illegal to be LGBTQ identified. Or
Hmm.
if you're LGBTQ identified, now you must change or now you must seek some kind of
Yeah.
counseling and you're not going to be able to find gay affirming counseling. And that's simply false.
Yeah.
That's simply false. What we're doing is carving out a space, protected space for sexual minorities who don't want to adopt that ideology and want to embrace a different path.
Yeah.
And so such an important court case. I'm thinking about Scott Wiener's
Hmm.
response today in California, Senator Wiener's response talking about torture. And as I'm listening to him, he's saying, "Oh, now LGBTQ children," which is something let's put a pin in that. I want to talk about what that could be. But
Hmm.
children are now going to be fearful because the Supreme Court now upholds torture for LGBTQ identifying people. And my immediate response to that is Weiner is trying to establish official dogma, the official line of reasoning and thought around this Supreme Court and around this case so that there's consistency in language across the board among activists that now speech can be torture.
Hmm.
And what that means to me is, or what that signals to me is just how fragile this group of people is.
Hmm.
And, you know, uh, there's that's framed in such a way, we in California, we know that the direction of that is a hate speech law. A hate
Yeah.
speech law that now declares that Christianity could be, by a declaration of the gospel, could be considered hate towards LGBTQ identifying people.
Hmm.
And I just want to say that uh, nothing, in my opinion, is better news than the gospel for people who
Hmm.
identify as LGBTQ. I mean, the
Yeah.
full redemption that Christ offers us in our dignity, in our value and worth, and in our life purpose is unparalleled.
Yeah.
And so, but this inflammatory language, this thought that Wiener is having that now, the way Christians speak, conservatives speak now should be considered hate speech, in his opinion, or torture, in other words. That is a very slippery slope that I hope is quickly corrected.
And really doesn't make any logical sense. The liberal Supreme Court justices, I dare say, would not have voted the way that they did in favor of, Chiles, if they had believed that torture was going to be released upon a minority group. None of the justices would have, I believe.
Yeah.
And no one's in favor of that. No one will be being tortured as a result of this. So that is tragic. And I want to go back to something you said about, the fragility of this people group. It is a very difficult journey, as you and I know by personal experience, to navigate. There are
Yes.
a lot of voices in your own head, and there are a lot of voices in culture, and everybody, many people have strong opinions, and no, that's one of the reasons why we are advocating for all the freedoms for counselors to be able to say whatever they need to say in order to encourage and support whoever's asking for help, even a child. So,
Yeah.
gosh, let's not change America to the extent that we have state mandated viewpoints that is the way that we're going to protect people.
Yeah.
To go that direction in America is to step off into a dystopian world compared to what we're used to.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, that's a good segue to Scott Wiener's statement about children. So what a conversion therapy ban demands that a child who's questioning their sexuality or their gender may not receive any professional care to question the feelings that they're having.
Yeah.
And so you must affirm the identity or the perceived identity. And we've seen, like with Chloe Cole and others, how dangerous that is for children who experience gender dysphoria,
Yeah.
that gender incongruence, which so many of us from the LGBTQ population experience not gender dysphoria, but that incongruence between our biological sex and our affect or our perceived gender. So nothing, in my opinion, could be more harmful than a conversion therapy ban for children by demanding that a child, so many of us from Changed have been sexually abused as children. And so a conversion therapy ban demands that a child may not ever find a private space to discuss with a counselor some sexual abuse they might have experienced.
Mhm.
Talking to your parents about that can be terrifying, and going into a counseling office which instead of trying to remedy or resolve the sexual abuse and the developmental impacts on that child, would simply say, okay, now the deed's done, basically, let's just affirm these feelings that you have, rather than unraveling or deconstructing them for the betterment of that child.
Mhm.
That's terrifying to me.
It
Um,
is terrifying because, boy, children rely upon adults, specifically parents, to help them navigate their whole lives, everything they're experiencing. And so to lock someone into an identity, especially after they've just experienced a trauma without investigating that trauma, doesn't even make any logical sense. I mean, even your story, Elizabeth, I've heard you tell before that after you encountered a trauma, all of your pictures changed. The pictures of you immediately changed. You no
that's right.
longer wore girly clothes. I mean, obviously something traumatic happened. Of course we should look at that
Yeah.
without any bias, without any state mandated viewpoint, right?
I mean, if I could have received, if my parents, we're too old to really, our generation never took their children to counseling.
No.
But if my parents could have seen, obviously, that I was distraught as a 5-year-old and, going from one affect to another. And, if I had sought counseling in that situation, years of pain and
Decade.
rejection of men, rejection of myself could have been addressed and even remedied. And today, wherever there's a conversion therapy ban and a child undergoes that, the risks are that child will be affirmed as transgender and go through puberty blockers or surgeries, never remedying the trauma, never remedying the abuse
Mhm.
or addressing the trauma somehow, but without the understanding that resolving it could also resolve the body dysmorphia or the dysphoria that's occurred. It's just so short-sighted. And I mean, I also think that children are being pushed into these identities, and that's the other harm.
I mean, if you want to talk about torture, back to Senator Weiner, Jess Rose, Chloe Cole, our friend Prisha. I mean, those people have experienced torture, and some as children or as minors, because they were forced down only one option. They weren't given a suite of offerings by which they might be helped. And so now they have physical problems in their bodies. There's a lot we could say about that, but they would say, several of them would say that that was torturous. And so let's not throw that word torture around without really thinking about what it means and does it apply here.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like the bottom line in my own heart is just we really need to revisit the whole topic and all the rhetoric around LGBTQ to
Yeah.
distill what is it? What are people experiencing? What could be remedied? Prioritizing, you know, one of the things that the APA, like Lisa Diamond will say, okay, so sexual fluidity is well documented, particularly among women.
Hmm.
And she'll say, what it really comes down to is upholding an individual's desire to follow this ideology as and choose a certain path rather than anything else. It's not about some inherent civil right that is biologically informed. It's about an ideology or a view. And I think that getting to this discussion of is is heteronormativity the ideal? And I mean, for us and for children, particularly, we have so many friends who have been affected by divorce, for example. So
Yeah.
intact family and family systems has just as much to do with a person's identity and self-perception as anything else. And getting back to the place where family is upheld, children are protected in a marriage between a man and a woman and raised in that space is the right and true pathway to take.
And there are thousands of studies that indicate that growing up in that kind of a family structure is the healthiest and gives the best outcomes to children. That's not just someone's opinion.
And what we're beginning to discover now is that family system has a lot to do with sexual development, sexual identity development. And I think that there's so much research that could be done on the mental health of LGBTQ identifying people that isn't done today simply because that worldview has to be protected.
Mm, yeah. We say, let freedom ring
That's
in
right.
this issue.
Once again, just celebrating that this Supreme Court decision has finally been released. We've been expecting it for several months. It is a huge win for change. And now the next step will be seeing what new court cases emerge around free speech and First Amendment rights for counselors, particularly in these states that have conversion therapy bans. And in the very least, every counselor who is counseling today can feel the protection of this Supreme Court decision, even if they live in a state where a ban is in place. This opens up the possibility of protections, even where it's been made illegal. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I think we're entering a new era when it comes down to addressing these feelings.
Yeah, and I just wanna say to the counselors out there who have never been trained on how do I help someone who has a goal of dealing with the trauma underneath same-sex attraction, things like that, there actually are methodologies and clinical approaches that have just been long either forgotten or expunged that we will be working to kind of point counselors to in the coming months, but, there's some I mean, as a minor, when I was getting counseling for my same-sex attraction, there were some great help, some great just therapeutic approaches that were very helpful to me. So just want to encourage the counselors out there who are like, well, now what do I do if I have the freedom? We have close friends who know exactly what approaches can be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, with that, especially the International Foundation for Therapeutic and Counseling Choice, and we encourage people to look them up because they have very strong standards of care and ethics statements on what is appropriate and what is not, and then a full learning curriculum for clinicians and for researchers and for pastors. And so we're looking forward to the completion of that curriculum, which is in the works. But they are going to be a great resource for counselors in the U.S. who want to be able to offer increased care, opportunity for conversations in this topic. and yet don't have uh, much experience or particularly much training. We look forward to further conversations on this topic for sure, but we're glad that you joined us today as we declare that freedom reigns in the U.S.